Once upon a time, there was a movie called Godzilla. Yeah, I know, there was a whole bunch of Godzilla movies, but for the purposes of today's video, we're talking about this one. The one from '98. Whatever you want to call it, but we'll play it straight for now. So apparently, even though people hated this movie, it was still popular enough to warrant an animated series because they teased a sequel that never came, and instead we got a cartoon featuring the spawn of Godzilla fighting other monsters, and this one even had atomic breath. And listen, people can say and have said whatever they want about that movie, and I really don't care for it personally, but I do remember enjoying the cartoon more so than the movie, mostly because they tried to make it into a genuine Godzilla series with monster fights and such, even if they had to use the movie version nobody liked, allegedly. So naturally, said cartoon would be popular enough to warrant a video game, because sure, why not? Every cartoon gets its own video game at some point. Hence today's subject matter, Godzilla the series, released in 1999 for Game Boy Color, courtesy of Crave and Crawfish Interactive. A year later, a sequel entitled Monster Wars would be released, but that's another story for another time. The big selling point of this game is that Godzilla is, according to the back of the box, the largest Game Boy character ever, and he certainly has enough of a claim to that case. However, that's not necessarily a good thing, since he's apparently so big, he couldn't even fit onto the full screen, relegating him to the left side at all times. Now, to be fair, he does look alright for the most part, animates well enough for the few things that he does, and when he eventually gains the foot stomp move and you do that repeatedly, he looks like he's frolicking about without a care in the world. So here is how Godzilla the series works. You do not technically control Godzilla, he just moves to the right. The most you control is his head and the few actions at your disposal. Pressing up or down aims his head, and you press A to shoot fireballs in the direction that he's facing. The B button will unleash a tail whip attack, which is sometimes useful. Pulling back on the D-pad will cause Godzilla to stop and block. For as long as his guard meter is up, it will prevent him from receiving damage because, like it or not, you will take hits, but if you block them, you will be fine. Every 5,000 points earned will net Godzilla either a new attack such as the foot stomp or bite, or will incrementally upgrade his attacks a level for whatever that's worth. Also, over time, your health meter will increase, bit by bit. So as Godzilla is moving about, planes, tanks, and other things will pop up and try to inflict damage. You could either block the attacks or try to kill the foes with your abilities. Response time has a very noticeable delay. It takes about half a second, at least, between button press and the actual execution of the attack, which is very, very annoying. The gameplay in general is very sluggish. Godzilla moves very slowly, which is funny because this version is supposed to be the much slimmer, much quicker lizard thing that eats fish. If this were traditional Gojira, it'd be one thing, but even then, So he moves slowly, the levels drag on forever, there's periods where absolutely nothing is happening, and it puts you to sleep, and then next thing you know, you wake up and it's game over because you just passed out due to oxygen deprivation because this game sucks wind. The game does have boss battles, but they're lame. You shoot fireballs and block attacks, and then sometimes the boss will flee and you'll have more level to contend with. And Godzilla the series, in theory, isn't a very long game. It has 5 or 6 levels tops, I lost count. But because the gameplay is sluggishly slow and dull, because the levels last forever, because there are spaces with a whole lot of nothing happening, it just feels like a much longer game. But what also doesn't help is the total lack of music. Other than the opening title sequence, which is a neat bit of animation by Game Boy standards, the game has no music to speak of, just a handful of tinny sound effects to barely fill the audible void that is the rest of the game. Presumably all the space on the cart was taken up by the scratchy digital noise that is supposed to be Godzilla's traditional roar that is barely audible in that whole mess of noise. Terrible. Aside from Godzilla, there's also another giant monster that you fight that's a boss that's big and that's equally lame. The terrain you travel through is rather dull looking, and the various tanks and stuff you fight are just there. Nothing special, visually speaking, aside from Gino. The game does have cutscenes, but they're just talking heads, and there's also no music or sound of any kind. You could skip these if you want, perhaps a bit too easily, but whatever. The game sports a password feature, which is nice, and also I should note that this game does have backwards compatibility with the old Game Boy, and if I'm going to be honest, I actually prefer this game in monochrome. It just looks a little better when you drain away all the color. Overall, Godzilla the series is not a particularly good game. It might feature one of, if not the biggest character sprite in a Game Boy title. I am more than willing to not argue this point because I really don't care. But unfortunately, it comes at the cost of everything else. The gameplay is poor, the control is horribly delayed, the audio is virtually non-existent, and this whole thing just likes to waste your time. What shocks me more than the fact that this mess comes from Crawfish Interactive, who usually does good stuff on the Game Boy side of things, is the fact that this mess of a game got a sequel that may or may not be worse than this. We'll find out next time, but as far as this game is concerned, very shallow, very boring, not worth your time. Don't bother. This may actually be worse than the NES game. I didn't even think that was possible, but there you go. Fucking hell.